I'm so disappointed I can't be with you in person, but as I picture you there in the beautiful Outer Banks, I'd like to start by paying my respects to the Algonquian people. We can only wish that all the English colonists had been as open as Harriot. He was indeed a great and open-minded explorer, both in America and in the world of science. So today I'd like to share with you a little about his maths, science and astronomy. But first, let me bring him back into the room with us in the next slide. No one knows if this famous painting really is of Harriot. He's nothing if not enigmatic. We don't really know what he looked like, when he was born, or who his parents were, although we do know that they were working people, not gentry. We also know that he studied at Oxford, which you can see in the next slide, pretty much as Harriot would have seen it. To add to the mystery, Harriot never published any of his scientific work. We only know about it because some 8,000 pages of his research notes were found hidden away in an old castle 150 years after he died. It's in Petworth, Sussex, in the south of England, and you can see a picture of it in the next slide. The house you see at the distance here was rebuilt in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's now with the National Trust, but in Harriot's time, this was the estate of his second patron, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, and it's still the home of the Earl's descendant, Lord Egremont, who has been a great supporter of Harriot's scholarship. I'll talk more about the connection with Northumberland later, but let's start with Harriot's first job with the flamboyant Walter Raleigh. Raleigh wanted his captains and navigators to be the best trained in the world, and of course, key to navigation is astronomy. In those days, it really was sailing by the stars. First up, you have to know how to locate the stars, and you can see this in the next slide. You can see right away that there are angles involved here, and as you might remember from school, angles mean trigonometry, sines, cosines, tangents, and so on. This is the way astronomers had pinpointed the stars since ancient Greek times, and other ancient cultures did essentially the same thing, but more intuitively. Of course, knowing the math makes navigating much more accurate, especially for long journeys such as Raleigh was planning. The top diagram shows how the stars' altitudes are measured from the observer's point of view. The bottom one shows a general theoretical picture where altitudes are measured with respect to the celestial equator. They can also be tabulated with respect to the ecliptic, the sun's apparent yearly path through the sky. And in those days, most people still believed that the sun was indeed travelling around the Earth, rather than vice versa. The next slide shows a medieval Syrian astrolabe, which was a traditional way that sailors at sea actually took their astronomical measurements. One of the crucial things Harriot taught Raleigh's men was how to find their latitude from the stars. First, they had to learn how to convert their own observations, measured with respect to their own particular horizon from wherever they happened to be at the time, with those tabulated with respect to the celestial equator or the ecliptic. All the necessary astronomical theory that Harriot taught is summed up in the next slide. Now we begin to see where Harriot's skill as an astronomer stands out from the pack. For instance, the diagram shows that latitude is equal to the altitude of the North Celestial Pole, shown at the top of the diagram. The star Polaris is right near this pole, and it had long proved a handy proxy. But Harriot was a stickler for detail, and he knew that because Polaris isn't exactly in line with the North Celestial Pole, sailors using it could end up dangerously lost. Every degree of latitude corresponds to about 69 miles, so you can see how errors could quickly mount up and leave you stranded. What's more, Harriot knew that his own measurement of the angular distance between Polaris and the pole was more accurate than the standard one used by most navigators. The next slide shows one of the instruments he used to take such measurements. It's an Armillary Sphere. The rings embody the lines in the previous diagram, such as the celestial equator and the ecliptic. This elaborate device is now in the Oxford Museum of the History of Science, but Harriot may well have used this very one, for it once belonged to his second patron, Northumberland. Either way, he was probably the most accurate observational astronomer of his time. For instance, his measurement of the radius of the Sun was 10 times more accurate than the standard one at that time. It agrees with NASA's to within 0.04%. Similarly, he didn't just accept the standard figure for Polaris's position, but made his own measurement. The next slide shows a detail, slightly fuzzy I'm afraid, of the beautiful ecliptic ring on Northumberland's Armillary Sphere. Harriot used his new measurement to make new tables, showing Raleigh's navigators how to convert their observation of Polaris's altitude to that of the pole, and hence to work out their current latitude more accurately. It's through this kind of attention to detail that Harriot ensured Raleigh's men were indeed the best trained in the world at that time. The next slide shows another of his navigational innovations. A rhumb line is the route you travel if you sail according to a fixed compass bearing. Intuitively, this feels as if you'd be sailing in a straight line, but of course the Earth's surface is curved, so you'd actually be sailing along a spiral, as in the top diagram. Raleigh's navigators were heading for a destination somewhere a little north of Spanish Florida, so his captains needed to know how far to sail in a given direction in order to change their latitude and longitude by the required amount. Harriot worked out the mathematical theory needed. You can see some of it in the lower diagram. This enabled him to make tables relating the compass bearing and the required position changes with the distance to be sailed. The next slide shows why he needed to make these tables. Model globes were new at the time and they were very expensive and cumbersome, but they couldn't yet be mass-produced. Mercator's famous map was new too, and local maps had not yet been produced, so mariners generally had to rely on tables to guide them. To make his tables for navigating along a rhumb line, Harriot had to add up, by hand, using a scratchy quill, thousands of incremental values of a function called sec theta, where the latitude theta changes 1 minute at a time. So he needed 60 sums just to move 1 degree. Any math buffs in the audience might recognise that today this kind of adding up is done with the algorithms of integral calculus, but it would be another 80-odd years before Newton and Leibniz invented them. Meantime, the next slide gives you just a taste of how laborious this kind of arithmetic was in those days before calculus and before electronic calculators. This is one of Harriot's manuscript pages, which Lord Egremont generously allowed me to use in my book. It's related to spherical triangles like those in the earlier diagram, and it shows just how much patience he and his mathematical colleagues must have had. As for his rhumb lines, Harriot was tantalised by the possibility of finding an exact formula so that he wouldn't have to do all that laborious adding up. So let me tell you a bit about his formidable algebraic skill. He seems to have been the very first mathematician to work entirely in terms of symbols. Today we're used to learning about x's and y's at school, but for thousands of years, algebra had been done with words, not symbols. In fact, in 1631, 10 years after his death, Harriot's friends published a textbook of his algebra, and it was the very first math book written in essentially modern symbols. This algebraic skill eventually enabled Harriot to work out the formula for the exact distance along a rhumb line, the same formula we get today with integral calculus. The next slide gives you a glimpse of the math he used to make this extraordinary discovery. Harriot was a pioneer in applying what's called infinite series, where you can get an algebraic expression for the infinite sum of a series of ever-decreasing numbers, as in Harriot's spiral approximation, shown on the bottom right, if you follow the letters from B through D, E, F, and so on around the spiral. He used the theory of this series to add up all the little segments, giving him an algebraic formula for the length of the spiral. So you can see that he was actually homing in on the idea of integral calculus. He also found the formula for what we call the integral of sec theta, which he needed to make more accurate rhumb line tables, without all that tedious adding up by hand. And he was the first person to actually work out the length of a curved line like this, other than a circle. so it was quite a breakthrough. By now, though, we've covered quite a few years since young Harriot first joined Walter Raleigh's household, so in the next slide, I'll check in briefly on his personal life. Harriot never married as far as we know. He seems to have dedicated his life to scholarship. But he was very sociable. He had lots of friends, including Raleigh, with whom he'd become very close. His early astronomical and mathematical work was done for Raleigh in the 1580s and 90s, and it was tied firmly to navigational applications. But Harriot yearned to go deeper into science and math for their own sakes. And then, as if by a miracle, in 1597, Raleigh's friend, the Earl of Northumberland, whose picture you see here, offered Harriot a golden opportunity. He would pay him to work on whatever he wanted to. So, although he stayed loyal to Raleigh and continued to advise him when needed and to act as his accountant, with Raleigh's blessing he took rooms with the Earl at Sion House, a few miles away. The next slide shows a picture of the gatehouse at Harriot's impressive new address. Sion was the residence near London that Northumberland used in Harriot's time, rather than his ancestral home at Petworth. The astronomical and navigational breakthroughs I spoke about earlier were way ahead of their time, and they were made before the first commercial telescope was patented in October 1608. With his newfound freedom at Sion, you can imagine how eagerly Harriot took up this new tool. Telescopes were initially sold as a sort of toy. People like to look at distant vistas and also to peek in through their neighbours' windows. But as you may know, Harriot was the first to leave a surviving record of a telescopic astronomical observation. It was a rough and rather uninspiring sketch of the crescent moon, but it was the very beginning of the new era of telescopic astronomy. He made it on July 26, 1609, apparently a few months before Galileo began doing the same thing. But Harriot soon created much better astronomical images than his crescent moon. You can see his famous full moon map in the next slide. Northumberland paid Harriot so well that since 1605 he'd employed a lens maker and lab assistant, Christopher Tooke. Together they made their own telescopes with magnifications up to 50 times, much greater than the one you could buy at the time. Galileo was doing the very same thing. You can see in the slide that Harriot has carefully labelled 49 features, including craters. Modern scholars have confirmed the high degree of accuracy of this map, as well as his measurements of what would later be called Halley's Comet, and of sunspots, which you can see in the next slide. These mysterious shadowy patches had been observed by intrepid naked eye astronomers, but at the end of 1610, Harriot began studying them with a telescope. Once again, Galileo was independently doing the same thing at the same time. All these parallel astronomical discoveries are one reason Harriot has been dubbed the English Galileo. The other reason is that Harriot also discovered the law of falling motion, which has long been seen as unique to Galileo. Matthias Schemmel did the extraordinary work reconstructing Harriot's discoveries on gravity, which he published just a decade or so ago. As for sunspots, the record Harriot made in this slide is just one of his 200 painstaking sunspot observations. It shows that the spots appear to be moving to the right as you move down the page, as if the sun is rotating. Copernicus had suggested the Earth was rotating as well as revolving, but the idea of a rotating sun was new. Harriot, ever the mathematician, realised that he could use his extensive records to calculate the period of solar rotation, and he was the first to do the same with Jupiter's moons, which Galileo had been the first to observe. The next slide shows part of a memorial to Harriot established at Sion in 2009 to commemorate the beginning of telescopic astronomy. The gold plaque in the middle shows that historic first sketch of the crescent moon. But Harriot did many other things than astronomy during the 23 years he lived at Sion. I've mentioned already some of his algebra and the kinds of math he needed to complete the work on runline spirals that he'd begun with Raleigh. He worked on a lot of algebra at Sion, a lot of pure mathematics related to solutions of equations. But he also did some applied math. For instance, he was the first to find the general formula for continuously compounding interest. This was another pioneering application of infinite series, and he may well have worked on it because Northumberland was always loaning and borrowing money. There were no banks yet. Harriot also made the first quantitative estimate of exponential population growth, 2 centuries ahead of Thomas Malthus. He showed how binary arithmetic works, the kind of binary numbers used today to run computers, a century before Leibniz. And he did much more, for he saw himself first and foremost as a mathematician. But the next slide shows that he was also a meticulous experimenter. Everyone knows that if you step into a pool of water, your leg appears bent. But people had been trying to figure out the exact amount of refractive bending for nearly 2,000 years. Today, the law of refraction is generally known as Snell's law, but Harriot had discovered it at Sion 20 years earlier, and in a far more detailed way than Snell. That's because Harriot investigated refraction in different pairs of media, not just air and water, and in each case, he carefully measured what we call today the index of refraction. You may have read popular articles suggesting that the 10th century Baghdad-based scholar Ibn Sa'al was the first to find the law of refraction, but this is not quite right. In his theoretical work on glass lenses, he did leave a remarkable diagram that suggests the right amount of bending, but so far there's no evidence that he deduced this from experiment or that he generalised it to all pairs of refractive media. Rather, his diagram seems to have been a geometric exercise on lenses, and it certainly deserves to be celebrated as the first mathematical analysis of geometric optics. But as far as the current evidence suggests, it wasn't a discovery of a new law of nature. Harriot, by contrast, made many careful and repeated measurements, and unlike Ibn Sa'al, Snell, and even Descartes, who expressed their results in terms of geometrical diagrams, Harriot actually wrote the results explicitly as the sine law we use today. He also measured the refraction of different colours of the spectrum and figured out the math explaining how rainbows form. And he did this more than half a century before Isaac Newton's famous work on these topics. But Harriot also tried to understand why refraction happens, and the next slide shows his attempt at an explanatory diagram. Harriot believed in the controversial idea that matter was made of atoms. He was on the right track in his conjecture that the spacing of atoms determined whether or not light reflected off a surface or passed into it, especially in terms of his example of reflective solid gold compared with translucent gold leaf. And he wasn't entirely wrong in suggesting that refracted rays were bent because they interact with the new medium atom by atom. Although, of course, the modern physics of atoms is much more complex than Harriot's simple billiard ball model. He had a veiled debate over atomism in letters with Kepler, veiled because the ancient Greek idea that everything was made of atoms was a live but dangerous topic. Dangerous because the Greek atomists had assumed atoms were eternal, which meant that, contrary to the Bible, God couldn't have created the world from nothing. Concerns over atomism also had mathematical implications. I mentioned earlier Harriot's work on infinite series, which included adding up infinitesimally small numbers, so this work too could be controversial. No wonder Harriot didn't publish it. He told Kepler he wished he could philosophise more freely, but the mainstream was still stuck in the mud. But this didn't stop Harriot's curiosity, and his intellectual productivity shows that Sion was an idyllic place to think and do research, as you can see in the next slide. At least it was idyllic when there wasn't political trouble brewing. In 1605, a small group of radical Catholics, including Guy Fawkes and a distant cousin of Northumberland, planted gunpowder under the House of Lords, which they planned to blow up when the King opened Parliament on November the 5th. On November the 4th, however, Northumberland hosted a fateful dinner with a group of friends and Sion residents, including Harriot and the Earl's Catholic cousin. of whom it seems no one suspected a thing. The next slide shows the dining room at Sion. The house itself is essentially unchanged since Harriot's time, but the interiors and landscaping were remodelled in the 18th century. But we can imagine Harriot and Northumberland in a similarly grand dining room when suddenly there was a knock at the door. It was Guy Fawkes, and he and the Earl's cousin hurried back to London. After the plot was foiled and the plotters fled, everyone present at that dinner was questioned. Northumberland and Harriot were thrown in jail. Fortunately, Harriot was released after a few terrifying weeks, but the innocent Earl spent the next 16 years in the Tower of London, shown in the next slide. They originally had real lions here. In this bleak place, Northumberland joined his friend Raleigh. King James had imprisoned him in 1603 on a spurious charge relating to an earlier Catholic plot. Harriot visited both his unlucky patrons regularly and helped out with their worldly affairs as much as he could. He'd also helped with Raleigh's legal defence and was doing research for Raleigh's great book, History of the World, a product of his enforced solitude. The next slide shows Raleigh's study in the Tower. Harriot also discussed science with Northumberland, who continued to pay him well even from prison. Astonishing as it seems today, Raleigh and Northumberland set up a still in the Tower grounds, and the Earl also had a bowling alley constructed. Later, their guards were not so accommodating. Nevertheless, Northumberland was also interested in the science of bowls and billiards, and so on his behalf, Harriot undertook the first detailed analysis of the mechanics of collisions. It was one of his last and greatest projects, in which he anticipated Newton's laws of motion. But time was running out too soon for Harriot, who by now was only in his late 50s. He was devastated when Raleigh was executed in 1618, and he himself was beginning to suffer serious ill health. You can see another view of the Tower grounds in the next slide. It's hard to believe such awful things once happened there. Harriot had long been addicted to the pipe smoking that he'd picked up in Roanoke ceremonies. He thought it explained the marvellous health the Algonquins seemed to enjoy. Tragically, the resulting cancer took his life on 2nd of July, 1621. Northumberland was released from prison 2 weeks later. One of the first things he did was sponsor a memorial plaque on Harriot's grave. The next and final slide shows how the Earl remembered his brilliant protégé. This is the slightly abridged text of Northumberland's poignant testament. It's a fitting place for me to say goodbye to Harriot and to you all, and to wish you a wonderful symposium.